You've got to be careful when reading some of them words in the Bible, haven't you? Good, right. I don't know, when you're reading your Bible, often we come across genealogies, don't we, in the Bible, whether it's in the Old Testament, in Numbers, or elsewhere, like in the Gospels, at the start of the Gospels. And often we come to those list of names, don't we? We're reading through faithfully, following a Bible reading plan, and we get to those lists of names, and our heart sinks a little bit, and we're like, oh, what good is this to me? And we tend to either just like, hop, skip, and jump, through some of the names. Do I recognize? Can I even pronounce any of these names? Or we tend to skip it, don't we? But at the start of Matthew's Gospel, Matthew gives us a genealogy from Abraham to Jesus. So Abraham, and then Isaac, and then Jacob, and so on and so forth. The son of, the son of, the son of, until we get to Jesus. Showing that Jesus is a direct descendant of Abraham. That's at the start of Matthew's Gospel in the New Testament. And at the end of that genealogy, it says this. It says, "Thus there were 14 generations in all from Abraham to David, 14 from David to the exile in Babylon, and 14 from the exile to the Messiah, to Jesus." So, and I find it fascinating that God separated out this biblical history, this story of the Israelites, into these equal chunks. The 14 generations, then another 14 generations, and then another 14 generations, all between Abraham and Jesus. And I kind of think, if I was to write the Bible, if I was to be God, I'll do something like that as well. I might pick a slightly rounder number than 14, but I quite like things to be neat and orderly and separated out into nice equal chunks, and that's something that I would do. But of course, God isn't just doing that just to be neat and orderly, is he? Because at each of these chapters in the story, each of these generational breaks in the story, God makes a covenant agreement with his people, with Abraham, and then with David, and then with the exiles going to Babylon, the Israelites who are sent into exile, and then finally Jesus, our Messiah. And so what I'm going to be doing is looking at those 14 generational breaks, those covenants, those agreements that God makes with his people. Now, Bob mentioned a couple of weeks ago that as leaders, when we're preaching, rather than preaching on a whole series altogether and taking a week each or a chapter each in a book, we're all going to bring our own series, and so I'm going to preach on these over the next few months as and when I come to preach. So this first covenant that God makes with his people right at the very start of their journey is with Abraham, just as Ruth read from Genesis chapter 15. Abraham is the father of the Israelites. He's where it all began, where the story begins for God's people, if you were. And God has already been journeying with Abraham a little bit. He's already promised that he's going to give him a son and give him descendants. And then in verse 1 we read this. It says, "After this the word of the Lord came to Abraham in a vision. He said, 'Do not be afraid, Abraham. I am your shield, your very great reward.'" So we first of all learn, right out of the gate, that God is our provider. God is saying, hey, I'm your shield. I'm going to protect you. I'm also your great reward. I'm going to provide for you. I'm going to give you everything you need. God's saying, hey, I'm all that you need, Abraham. I'm all you need for your protection. I'm all you need for your provision. And he says, don't be afraid. Don't worry. Don't worry about the future. Our lives can easily be driven by fear, by worry, by anxiety, can't they? The Mental Health Foundation, is an institution, like a charity in the UK, estimated that in 2012, about 20% of adults struggled with high levels of anxiety. Fast forward about 10 years to about 2022, so just after the pandemic, this has increased to about 30% for men and 37% of women struggling with high levels of anxiety, and that might be even higher today. We live in a society battling with anxiety, with depression, with other mental health issues, and that might be some of you here today. You might find yourself in that category today saying, hey, I'm struggling myself. I struggle with anxiety. I struggle with worrying about the future, about what is going to come my way. Our world might be greatly concerned about the future, might it? About socio-political unrest, by climate change, by financial recession. Our world may be very, very, very sensitive and tense about what's going to happen in the future. Even what's happening in the news currently is quite uneasy. But we need not fear because of what Abraham heard from God. God said, I am your shield, your very great reward. And God says the same thing to us. Those words are written to us as well, that God is our shield and our very great reward. So we need not fear or worry or be anxious about our lives, about the future. We need not worry or be anxious that we might suffer or lose out in life, for our God is our shield and our very great reward. Now, it doesn't mean that life is going to be peachy. It doesn't mean that life is going to be rainbows and sunshine all the time, does it? But we have something more valuable than life itself in God. We can say it will be all right in the end because the end belongs to God. The end belongs to the Lord, and that's why we can say it's going to be all right. Either way, whatever happens in our story, whatever happens in the future, whatever life might throw at us, it will be all right in the end because the end belongs to the Lord. So we learn that God is a provider God. That's what God is making known to Abraham and to us and to his people at this very moment. He's saying right at the start, hey, I'm going to provide for you. I'm going to be your shield. I'm going to be your great reward. Now, fast forward a couple of chapters in Genesis, and Abraham and his wife Sarah have their son. God came true in his promise. He gave them their promised son, Isaac. And in Genesis chapter 22, just 7 chapters later, God tests Abraham. He says, he wonders, does Abraham really love me? Does Abraham really trust me? I've told him that I'm his shield, I'm his great reward, or is he going to cling to this son more than me? So he tests him and he says, Abraham, I want you to go up this mountain and I want you to sacrifice your son. I want you to give him give him away, sacrifice him, put him to death. And so Abraham does that diligently. He walks up the mountain with his son, and just as he's about to kind of plunge the dagger in, God stops him at the last second and says, hey, it was only a test. And then the angel that appears to him provides a ram caught in the bushes, and this ram is then offered as an acceptable sacrifice instead of his son Isaac, and they sacrifice this ram. Okay, and at that point, Abraham calls that place the Lord will provide. The Lord will provide, and from that passage, we know God to be Jehovah Jireh, God our provider. Yeah. Because that's what God proved himself to be to Abraham. He said, hey, I'm going to test you. It's not going to be easy, but I'm going to provide for you. God provided a way to Abraham, and he provides for us as well. We know God to be Jehovah Jireh, God our provider. And so we need to trust in him as our provider, as our shield, as our reward, don't we? When we collect our kids from school, often when the kids come out of school or Luke out of nursery, they come out of school carrying their bags and their coat, and they instantly, you probably recognize this if you're a parent, they instantly see us and then just do that. Here you go, Mum and Dad, carry my stuff. And I'm like, carry your own stuff. That they instantly just want to offload their coat and their bag or whatever they're carrying, craft they've made, onto their parents, and they instantly expect you to carry it so that they can run around and play. And of course, as loving parents, you take it on and you're saddled with all this stuff. But that's what we need to learn to do with God, isn't it? That we need to come to God and say, hey God, here are my burdens, here are my cares. Please can you carry them? Please can you take care of them? I entrust them to you. Psalm 55 says, cast your cares on the Lord and he will sustain you. cast them, throw them onto God. This problem that I'm worrying about, this financial situation, this doctor's diagnosis, this, uncertainty about my future, about what my kids are going to get up to, or how my marriage is going to pan out, or how my health is going to deteriorate. Whatever you're carrying, it says, hey, cast your cares on the Lord. Lift them up to Jesus and say, God, please, would you take care of this for me? I don't want to worry about it. I don't want to be anxious about it. Our kids don't worry about our family demands, our family burdens, what bills we need to pay, or putting food on the table, or making ends meet. Imagine if my kids, worried about, us paying our mortgage one day, or worrying where we're going to buy food for. That wouldn't be right, would it? It wouldn't be fitting. So it's not fitting for children to carry the burdens that adults are meant to carry. Yet that's the same thing that we do as grown-ups, isn't it? Instead of offloading our burdens and our cares onto God, we tend to carry them ourselves, don't we? And we start to carry burdens which are unfitting for us. We start to worry about things we have no control over and we don't need to worry about. We start to carry burdens we don't need to carry. And instead, we need to remember how to be children, don't we? Children of God, and say, God, please take these. Please carry these. You're my shield. You're my great reward. I'm entrusting my life to you. Now, it doesn't mean that we don't do anything practically. It means that we put practical measures in, do what we can to make that financial burden go away. We do all we can in a practical kind of human sense. But at the end of the day, when we're carrying that stress and that anxiety in our heart, we need to say, God, please can you take this from me? Carry this burden for me. Carry this concern. Romans 8 says, the spirit you received does not make you slaves so that you live in fear. Rather, the spirit you received brought about your adoption to sonship, and by him we cry, Abba, Father. Yeah, so as Christians, we don't need to live in fear or worry or anxiety, because we have a loving Father who is our shield, who is our provider. And I know that can be easier said than done sometimes. I get that sometimes our burdens and our cares and our stresses, they cling to us like super glue, sticks to your skin, and it's hard to get rid of. But that's our battle that we face, and say, God, I'm going to try and give these things to you. So God, first of all, reveals himself as a shield, as a provider, as a blesser to Abraham. And later on, down in verse 6, it says, Abraham believed the Lord, and he credited it to him as righteousness. So God's saying, hey, I'm going to bless you, Abraham. I'm going to give you children. I'm going to give you descendants. Look up at the stars, see if you can count them. So will your descendants be. And it says, Abraham believed God, and God credited it to him as righteousness. You see, all that God asked of Abraham was to believe in him, to trust in him. Yeah? Didn't have to do anything else. Just to trust in him, just to believe in him. There wasn't an ABC or a 1, 2, 3 or a list of prerequisites. Oh, sorry, Abraham, you haven't done this yet. You can't have my blessing. He just said, hey, you just have to trust in me. You just have to believe in me. Now, the Bible does teach that our deeds, our actions should match up with our faith. But really, right deeds, right actions just flow out of a right faith. So really, it's all about our heart. And this is the truth of the gospel as well, that all we have to do is believe and trust in God. God doesn't come to us with a list of requirements saying, hey, if you tick off A, B, and C, then I'll accept you. Yeah? Then I'll forgive you. He just says, hey, trust in me. Come to me. And that we might find forgiveness in Jesus. We don't need to tidy ourselves up before coming to God. That's what it means today. God only asked Abraham to trust in him, to believe in him. And that's all he asks of us. So it means that when we approach God, when we come to God, and you might not be a Christian in here this morning, we'll know that you don't need to tidy yourselves up before coming to God. We go to the doctors to get well, don't we? And we come to Jesus to find forgiveness. We don't need to have ourselves all tidied up and squared up before we come to him. When I was at university, we lived in Lancaster, and I had a couple of housemates. One of our housemates was called Matt, and he wasn't a Christian. And one day I invited him to church. I said, hey, Matt, I'm going to church this morning. Do you fancy coming with me? And he said, oh, I'm not good enough to come to church, so nah, I'll leave it for today, thanks. And I thought, well, yeah, I know you're not, but neither am I. None of us are. And that's precisely the point. We don't need to be good enough to approach God. That's the whole point. We don't go to a doctor once we're well, once we're good enough in our health, do we? We go when we need to, don't we? And when we need healing. Anyway, he came anyway. I managed to convince him to come. He had a good time. And then we went home and had some lunch. And when chatting afterwards, my friend Matt had said, he described his experience of going to church for the first time in many years. And he said, I was anxious that as I walked in the door, I thought the roof might collapse on top of me. I thought the walls might collapse on top of me because I'm a sinner and I'm going into church. And some of you might feel like that this morning. Some of you might have had that experience before. You can go into the church for the first time in a long time or something like that. You might feel unworthy and inadequate, but that's okay, because that's the starting point of the gospel in our lives. We're all unworthy. We're all inadequate. Jesus meets us in our unworthiness, in our inadequacy. Yeah? And that's where we find our forgiveness. He gives us his righteousness. So it's righteousness that isn't earned, that we haven't worked for. It's just given when we come to him and we say, God, I'm unworthy. I'm inadequate. Yeah? And in that moment, in that transaction of faith and trust in him, we get his righteousness. It says in verse 6 that God credited it to him as righteousness. He gave him righteousness. So simply because Abraham believed God, God gifted him righteousness. And this is what theologians call imputed righteousness. Imputed. It means that we take on the righteousness of Christ. So it's a righteousness that doesn't necessarily belong to us, that we haven't worked for, or we haven't gained by ourselves. It's just been assigned to us. Yeah, like if someone just transferred you £1 million into your bank account, you hadn't worked for it, but suddenly, overnight, you become a millionaire, and it's just been imputed to you. It's just been transferred to you. Now, just to kind of illustrate this, I just want to show you something. Now, I have a pair of sunglasses which I bought a little while ago, and I think there's a funny thing about my sunglasses. I think they're like polarized or something like that, which means that they filter out light in a certain direction. So when I look at my phone screen through my sunglasses, I can see my phone screen normally like that, but as soon as I rotate it on the side, I can't really see it very well. It all becomes dim. I can't really see my phone screen, and that's because it filters out light in a certain direction, and I can't quite see it. And it's even worse on like my camera screen or other screens that are older. I can't see it. I can't read the text for some strange reason. And that's what like imputed righteousness is. That when God looks at our lives, he doesn't see our sin. He doesn't see our failure. He doesn't see our shame, because he looks at us through Jesus Christ, and he sees the righteousness of Christ, because his righteousness has been transferred to us. Yeah. But that's only because we're in Christ, and that's only because God is seeing us through the perspective of Christ and seeing that we're covered by Christ. So God doesn't see our sin. He sees Christ's righteousness. Just as if you were to, look out on the world through, rose-tinted sunglasses, everything would look rosy. Or yellow, everything would look yellow. Or green, everything would look green. So when God looks at us through Christ, he doesn't see our sin, he sees Christ's righteousness. That's what imputed righteousness means, that we take on his righteousness, and that's what God sees of us. Isn't that good? The words of the hymn, Before the Throne of God, come to mind. It says, when Satan tempts me to despair and tells me of the guilt within, upward I look and see him there, who made an end to all my sin. Because the sinless Saviour died, my sinful soul is counted free. For God the just is satisfied to look on him and pardon me. That's what imputed righteousness is. That God looks on Jesus and pardons us. Yeah? That we have a righteousness not of our own. It's given. It's free. It's a gift. It's been transferred to us. We haven't worked for it. We haven't earned it. We're not worthy of it. But it's ours through faith in Jesus. And that's what God is kind of like, describing and in introducing to Abraham. He's saying, hey, this is a covenant of grace. It's a covenant where I'm going to give you my righteousness. And finally, we see that God passed between the pieces. So in this covenant agreement, God does something strange. Now, in ancient customs, whenever two parties or two people, would make a deal or a treaty, sometimes what they would do if they wanted to make that really binding, like really official, they would take some animals, they would cut them in two. It's not a very pretty agreement. So they cut them in two and separate out the pieces, half on the left, half on the right, and blood in between. And then both people in both parties or both people in the agreement would walk between the pieces. Yeah, and it was a way of saying that if either one of us break this deal, may we be like these pieces. May we be like these animals, cut in two, dead, decimated. Yeah, that was like just a cultural way of making an agreement. And you see that elsewhere in the Bible. It's funny because when you were kids, you thought spitting into your palm and shaking hands was like a blood-binding oath. This takes it to a whole other level, doesn't it? And in Abraham's vision, he then has a vision of a smoking pot and a burning torch, which then passes between the pieces. Now, this smoking pot, this burning torch represents God. Yeah, think of Moses and the burning bush, or the pillar of fire as the Israelites came out of Egypt. Those symbols of fire represented God's presence. They represented God. Yeah. So in the vision, Abraham sees this burning torch passing between the pieces, so representing God. So what God is doing here is that God is making a sworn promise to Abraham to fulfill these promises, what he's just described to Abraham. God's saying, hey, I'm going to bless you, I'm going to give you a son, I'm going to give you descendants, I'm going to give you this land, I'm going to give you all this stuff, and I promise I'm going to do that. And it's not just God saying, hey, pinky promise, handshake. He does this symbol where he says, hey, may I die if I don't do this. That's what that covenant agreement means. Which is crazy, isn't it? It's crazy to think that the God of the universe, the author of life, would make such a promise, would make such an agreement. And God's saying, like, may I die if I don't do this? Because that's what that meant. You were walking between the pieces and you were saying, hey, if either one of us breaks this deal, by right, I'll become like them. I'll die, So, and God can't die. It's impossible to die. So why is he saying all this? Now, the immediate context is God giving Abraham this promised land. He says, when the sun had set and darkness had fallen, a smoking brazier with a blazing torch appeared and passed between the pieces. On that day the Lord made a covenant with Abraham and said, to your descendants I give this land, from the Wadi of Egypt to the great river the Euphrates, the land of all these people. Okay, so the immediate context is God giving Abraham's and his descendants all this land. And you think, what on earth? Why is that so important? Why is God so determined that he would give like a crazy promise? Just give them a bit of land. Why is it so special? So this land that God is promising to Abraham is going to become the promised land that the Israelites will occupy. But it's not just the promised land that the Israelites will occupy for the next few centuries. It's symbolic of the place where Jesus will return and reign on the world. Okay, so the Bible describes describes one day that Jesus will return and he will rule from Jerusalem, which is in the promised land. Okay, and all of his people, the church, his people, will gather together with him at Jerusalem. Zechariah 14 describes that Jesus will descend on the Mount of Olives. His feet will touch the Mount of Olives, and it will split in two. He'll set up his throne at Jerusalem, and all his people will gather together. That's the picture that the Bible gives. Whether that will happen kind of like physically, or whether it's symbolic of God just meeting with his people, we're not too sure. But either way, it's about God dwelling with his people again. Yeah, it's symbolic of the place where God is going to dwell with his people again. Okay, so this is about the gospel. This is about a God wanting to dwell with his people in peace again. Yeah. Ultimately, this is about a father wanting to get his kids back and to live with his kids again, humanity. Isn't it? And let me tell you, as a father, if I lost my kids, there's nothing that I wouldn't do to get them back. and I wouldn't stop or rest until I got them back. Now, last year, just before Christmas, Luke was 2, and he had a habit of opening our front door by himself. He'd learned to open the door, okay? And so what we had to do, because he kept on opening the door and kind of wandering out into the yard, we had to keep locking the door, not just close it, but lock it. And one day, one of us had come back in, and it was late after work. It was dark, and we'd come back into the house, and I'd noticed that I couldn't see Luke. And I looked at the front door, and the front door was open, okay? And he'd opened the door, and he'd wandered out into the yard. So I ran out into the yard. We couldn't see him. We checked in the house, shouting, "Luke, Luke, where are you?" We couldn't see him, couldn't hear him, and so we started searching up the street, okay, looking in people's gardens. And eventually, a neighbour came out and spotted him, and found him in a garden up our street. And it was dark. There weren't any cars moving about at the time, but there were cars parked. What felt like, it was only a few minutes that he was gone for. But what felt like a few minutes felt like hours. When you feel like, oh, where's our son? We've lost him. We couldn't find him. And then the relief you have when you find him. And I'm sure maybe you might remember a time when you maybe lost a child, or and found them after some time. It's anxious, man. My heart was beating. We don't know where he is. Don't know where he's got up to. There's a stream at the back of our house as well. There's risks about, isn't there? So we know the anxiety, the sadness, the importance it is. That we want to know where our kids are. And that's the story of the gospel. That since the fall, since sin entered the world, God has lost his kids. There's been a separation between God and humanity. The children of God. And God is making a way to bring them back. To bring humanity back to him. And that's what this story is about. God's saying to Abraham, hey, this is the start of a journey. This is the start of a story where I'm going to get my kids back. I'm going to live with humanity again. I'm going to dwell with them in peace. And it's going to be in this place. And that's why I am so determined about this. And that's why, that may I die if I don't do this, because I'm going to get my kids back. I'm going to live with them again. I'm going to live in peace with humanity again. It's about the gospel, isn't it? It's the beautiful gospel. So here, God is making a sworn promise to Abraham that one day he will dwell with his people again, and that will be accomplished through Christ. Now, notice in Abraham's vision, and just to finish here, it's only God that walks between the pieces. Now, normally when people would make such an agreement, both parties would walk between the pieces, because that's the handshake, that's the pinky promise, okay? But in the vision, Abraham doesn't go through the pieces, yeah? It's only the symbol of God. The burning torch passes through, so only God passes between the pieces, meaning it's a one-way covenant. It's a one-way promise. God is making this promise to Abraham, and Abraham doesn't need to do anything. It's God saying, I'm going to do this, and that's it. It's my sovereignty. I've made this decision, You have nothing to say, Abraham. I'm just going to do it, okay? It's not a two-way thing. And neither is the gospel. We are saved by grace alone, by faith alone, through Christ alone. It's all of God and nothing of us. And you might say, well, I've got to trust in God. I've got to have faith in God. But the Bible even says that faith is a gift from God. Yeah? It's all by his grace. It's all by his mercy. It's all a one-way deal. And God just asks us to trust in him, just to believe in him. This is the reality of God's sovereign grace. Sovereign grace, that we were dead and trapped in our sin, yet in God's mercy and grace, he decided to do something about it. And I think that's what this first covenant is about. It's about sovereign grace. God's saying, hey, I'm going to be your shield. I'm going to be your great reward. Not because you've earned it, just because I am. Just because I've decided to be. I'm going to gift you my righteousness. It's free. You just have to trust in me. I'm going to bestow it upon you. It's mine to give. Just trust in me. And one day I'm going to dwell with my people in peace again. I've reserved a bit of land for us to live in together. Representative of all the earth. My people who are dead and lost in sin, they will be found and set free. I am a God of sovereign grace. That's what God's making himself known as this morning. Let's pray as we just meditate on that together.